You are now listening to the Survivors series with Kyle Fields, a One Love Media production.
Some episodes of the show are tough to make. This is one of them. There are certain topics that shake us to our core. Events that change lives, communities, and entire generations. School shootings are one of them. They are tragedies that leave behind deep wounds, not just for the survivors, but for the families, first responders, and communities that have to pick up the pieces. And the hardest part? We keep seeing them happen again and again. So today, we're not just talking about the statistics. We're not just rehashing headlines. We're diving into the reality of what happens in the aftermath. The survivors, the families, the officers who walk into those hallways, the counselors who try to help them heal, and yes, even the psychology of those who commit these acts. Because if we don't understand the full picture, how can we ever hope it to stop? This is the Survivor series. And today, we're having one of the most important conversations that we've ever had. There's no easy way to introduce today's episode because there's no easy way to talk about school shootings. But if we want change, if we want to understand how to prevent these tragedies, how to help survivors heal, and how to truly address what's happening in this country, we have to have these conversations.
Today, I'm honored to be joined once again by Dr. Laura Ellick, a licensed psychologist with extensive experience in trauma recovery, mental health, and resilience building. As we navigate the heartbreaking reality of school shootings, I wanted to bring in an expert voice to help us understand not just the psychological impact on survivors, families, and communities, but also the psychology behind the shooters themselves. We'll also be discussing the role of the media, the challenges in treating trauma survivors, and most importantly, what can be done to heal and prevent future tragedies. Dr. Ellick, thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure.
All right, let's go ahead and get into it.
Sure.
So, my first question has to do with first responders and law enforcement. First responders and law enforcement officers are often the first on the scene in these types of tragedies. Do you think that they are given enough resources to process what they've had to witness?
And I'm going to have to say, and of course, I've worked with some first responders, so, I'm going based on what they've told me, and I'm hopeful that things have gotten a little bit better and people are paying attention more to the mental health of first responders. But here's the thing, and this is according to the Institutes of Health, more than 80% of first responders experience traumatic events on the job. So if you are a first responder and they consider a first responder to be a paramedic, rescue team, firefighters, police, you are likely to experience some sort of trauma on the job. The other thing that SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, pointed out is that roughly 1 in 3 first responders develop PTSD versus 1 in 5 in the general population. So there's something specific that is going on with our first responder people. And it's primarily, I would think, because they are likely exposed not just to one trauma, but multiple traumas during the time that they are employed. And here's really what the problem is. Every time you have a trauma, you're building upon other traumas. So you may get some counseling or some, let's debrief and let's talk about this, but every time you have an additional trauma, that's something else that's piled upon the mountain that's already there. And we know that a lot of first responders may be afraid to discuss that they are struggling, especially like, let's say, police, because one of the first things that will happen is they'll go on desk duty and maybe have their gun taken away from them. And to a police officer, that's like devastating. So we have to look at the whole context in which, yeah, probably first responders are undertreated.
So I'm glad that you made the mention of them being afraid to get help, because my next question is, in your experience, are these professionals encouraged to seek help, or do they feel pressure to just push through the trauma?
And so many people who I work with whose job involves dealing with the people or some sort of security, let's say where they have access to like sensitive information. So I've seen this with airline pilots. I've seen this with police officers. I've seen it with firefighters. I've seen it with lawyers, believe it or not, doctors. There is a general sense of I don't want to get help because then it's going to be reported to whoever holds my license, my gun, my ability to do my job, and then I'm going to have a lot of trouble. So, yeah, it's a really big problem in a lot of these industries because you have to even just getting regular counseling for something that wouldn't involve having your gun taken away, just let's say some anxiety. You're going through a divorce and you have anxiety. There's a stigma against seeking help. And once you seek help, there is a mark on your back. So definitely in these particular fields, I've seen in my experience, underreporting and not asking for help.
And that's amazing that you say that they pretty much have to suffer in silence when we're also supposed to trust them with our lives and hope that they don't have a mental breakdown when they're responding to us because they're not getting the help that they really need.
Right, and that's really the dilemma, right? Is, if someone needs help, the idea is that, oh, they need help, they're unstable. But if they're not getting the help, that's the person I'm worried about, not the person who's actually in treatment.
Yeah, I trust somebody that's in therapy way more than I trust little Billy over here that is chopping stuff out or chopping stuff in the backyard for no apparent reason.
Right, right. So it's a systemic issue. And, I mean, obviously there are things that people's jobs are supposed to be protected. People are supposed to be allowed to have accommodations at work for appointments and for therapy and things like that. People just don't take advantage of that for very good reason. You don't want to lose your job over something like this. So I think
Right.
there's underreporting and I think there's undertreatment.
So, in your opinion, what kind of support do you think should be in place for first responders that are regularly responding to mass casualty events like school shooting?
I think there should be counseling that's available to everybody free, to be honest with you. I mean, that's just my personal opinion that there shouldn't be any obstacles to obtaining counseling. Now, here's the other problem. If a job provides counseling for its employees, then there's actually the potential that the job could require that that counselor report to the job what's going on in the treatment.
Yeah, and that's I mean, you're the psychologist, you are in this field, but isn't that really just go against doctor-patient confidentiality?
Yeah, and there's a lot of things that you learn as you get in the field. EAP programs, they work for the company, not for the employee. HR works for the company, doesn't work for the employee. So who is protected in those situations? It's the company. So, and a
Right.
lot of people don't have the time or have the money to go outside of the company to get counseling, and it should be available, especially to our first responders.
I absolutely agree. I mean, like I said, they go, well, you said it yourself. They go through not just one mass casualty event or, shooter event. They go through multiple during their career. And I know myself and I know how I deal with trauma. And after so many that I don't talk about, I go off the deep end. Not like crazy, crazy, but I lose it. So
Right.
I can only imagine the people who are supposed or who are sworn to protect us that carry a gun that don't get the treatment because of stigma. Just,
Exactly.
I mean, there was an officer who I guess you really wouldn't use the word postal because that's for the post office, but went on a killing spree of his own department, I think up north, because of PTSD and what he felt was racial discrimination in his department. There's got to be a line drawn somewhere to say, okay, we're going to make sure that our officers get help without scrutinizing them or without punishing them for it.
Right. Exactly. So there are people who have, they have private health insurance. They won't even use the private health insurance because they don't want a paper trail. So it's a real problem, and we're not talking, small numbers here. When we look at the people who suffer from PTSD, I was looking at some numbers, and it's about, out of all the first responders, like 400,000 was one of the statistics that I saw according to SAMHSA. So, I mean, it's not one or two people. It's your brother, your sister, your friend. It's in every community.
Right, right. So getting back to the school shootings and trying to unpack all of that. My next couple questions are going to be about understanding the trauma from school shootings. From a psychological standpoint, what kind of long-term impact do school shootings have on survivors, both physically injured and those who just witnessed the event?
So obviously, when you are going to school, school is supposed to be one of those places where you're safe, right? No matter, even for kids who have come from abusive homes, they would say that school was their safe place. Now, all of a sudden, school is actually not your safe place. And that's a little bit scary if you think about it. So I was looking at some of the statistics, and the statistics are all over the place. But if we were to go with, there there have been about 1,300 school shootings over the past 10 years. That's incredible, because you're looking at not just the kids or the teachers who were in that particular classroom or in that particular area where the shooting happened. It's everybody who was in the school, all of the first responders, all of their families. The numbers are just huge. But what we're seeing, obviously, is physically people who have long-term physical handicaps or issues related to the shooting. There was actually one woman recently, I believe she had been injured in Columbine. Don't quote me on that, but I know she was injured in one of the larger school shootings, and she just passed away, like however many years later it's been, from injuries related to the school shooting. So now that's considered a homicide versus a natural death. So the impacts continue to grow, but we deal with things like avoidance, right? We're going to avoid big places. We're going to avoid schools. We're going to avoid crowds. We're going to have anxiety because the world all of a sudden feels very, very unsafe. There may be survivor guilt Why did you live and your best friend didn't? We definitely see PTSD. And an interesting statistic I found is there's an increase in the use of antidepressant medication that persists for at least 5 years past the shooting. Now, I don't think the use of antidepressants is a bad thing, but what the statistic was pointing out is that the distress is to the extent that people need to seek out medication. Then, of course, we're going to have problems with crowds, with loud noises. But here's what's really interesting. There are increases in chronic absenteeism, kids who are held back in school in the 2 years after a school shooting, meaning they just couldn't regroup enough to get back into the classroom and learn. And the end result of that is that these people earn $115,550 less over their lifetime than people who weren't involved in a school, right? So it has an economic impact too. Graduation rates go down, teacher retention goes down, lower employment rates, increases in substance abuse, PTSD, depression, which means these people are going to have a hard time getting a job if they can't recover.
So, and the research that I found when I was researching for this episode, it's 2001. More than 200,000 students have experienced a shooting on their school campus. And as of 2023, over 400 individuals, students, teachers, staff, and bystanders have been killed in a school shooting. That is absolutely ridiculous.
The numbers are insane, right?
200,000, approximately 200,000 kids since 2001, since Columbine happened, have been a witness to a school shooting on their campus.
Yep. It's very scary.
So, how do these traumatic events affect students and teachers who weren't present but still attend or work at the school?
Oh my gosh. I mean, listen, everybody is connected in a school, right? Even schools that are a little bit larger, they're communities. They have their own identity. They're safe places. So it's like a little town. So everybody knows everybody in a school. So it could be a friend. It could be a friend of a friend. You may be present in the school. You may not see the shooting, but it's more than likely you have heard the chaos. It's more than likely you've heard guns firing. You may know someone who knows someone. So, even if you didn't directly witness it, just the secondary effect of being part of the trauma, being
Well, yeah, and you mentioned earlier too survivor's guilt. And I'm sure that people that were not at the school when it happened that lost somebody, I can only imagine if I had only went to school, that could have been me. I can picture it because it's so prevalent in the United States.
yes. Yes, absolutely. So, even looking at, for example, if we want to let's think about this, for example. Let's say a teacher, I'm making this up, but I'm sure this happened in one of the situations. Let's say a teacher jumped in front of a student to protect a student, and then the teacher died. Think about the guilt that student may have. So then you're dealing with the trauma of the shooting, the trauma of being the survivor, the why did he jump in front of me? Why was I saved? There's so many ways that it can go. And also thinking about the parents or husbands and wives who sent their children, sent their families, their husbands, fathers, sisters to school that day, and they never came back. So then you're expanding the definition of who is traumatized.
Right. And so, like with the Parkland shooting, law enforcement, first responders had families gather at the local fire department and wait for phone calls.
Mm-hmm.
And there were 20 families who never got the phone call
Right.
to tell them that their kid was okay. And I mean, I've never lost a kid, but I am a parent. And to think about losing my kid like that, I mean, I just get emotional thinking about it,
Mhm.
let alone that it would actually happen to me.
Right.
And I have heard stories of, you know, people who have lost their kids, especially at a younger age, who ultimately took their own lives. And I
Yes.
can't say that I approve of it, but I get it. I understand.
And as a parent, this I understand the thinking that, I'm a parent, I'm supposed to protect my child, and I wasn't able to protect my child from this. Now we know that there's no way a parent could protect their child. You send your child to school that day, you're doing what you're supposed to do as a parent. But as you're going through grief and grieving, your thought process kind of changes. Like, I failed my child.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, grief is not it's not the same for everybody. It does not hit everybody the same. I mean, there are some people that grief hits them way harder,
Yeah.
and honestly, people just need to understand. And I talked a lot about this in the episode that when it came to like people like Alex Jones who called the survivors crisis actors and just completely said that Parkland was made up, that
Mhm.
Sandy Hook was made up. You're telling the parents of those kids who died that your kid didn't mean anything.
Right.
And
Mhm.
how are you supposed to feel as a parent when somebody that gets national, maybe international coverage is telling the world that your kid didn't mean anything because he didn't exist, he didn't die?
Right. Yep. So the impact is, I don't think we even know really what the impact is. I can tell you, I haven't been through a shooting myself, but I can tell you after all of the shootings have happened, and not just school shootings, right? We're talking about mass shootings, things that happen at concerts, at wherever it could be in New Orleans, people running over people, with cars. I am way more uncomfortable in crowds than I ever used to be. And I'm way more watchful.
Yeah. Yeah, no, if I don't have to be out, I like to stay at home now. I mean, with everything that's happened within the past, say, 6 years, I am more comfortable, I feel more safe being at home. If I don't have to go out and hang out with somebody out there, I won't because it's not worth my mental space.
Right. Right.
Many people assume all school shooters have the same psychological profile, but that's not the case, and we know that.
Right.
So, can you break down the different categories like traumatized, psychotic, and psychopathic shooters?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is everybody assumes that someone who has been involved as a school shooter is mentally ill. And listen, people who are everyday regular people do not shoot up schools, do not shoot up concerts. So we kind of understand that. But the definition of mental illness in this particular case is we're talking about someone who is psychotic, who may have schizophrenia, right? And what we found is that only 5%. This was a study that was done by, I'm going to pronounce his name wrong. I think it's Dr. Girgis at Columbia University. He did a study in 2021 linked to all mass shootings, not just school shootings, and said only 5% were linked to severe mental illness, meaning some sort of psychosis. 25% of the shooters had some sort of depression or some other non-severe diagnosis or some sort of neurological disorder, which they didn't specify what it is, but I'm thinking like a TBI, history of multiple concussions, CTE, something like that. And then 23% of mass shooters had some involvement with substance abuse. But what was pointed out was that in half of all mass shootings, there were no red flags, no diagnosis of mental illness, no criminality, no substance abuse.
And
And that
so
is crazy.
and so That's also something that I uncovered in my research is most of the time the red flags didn't come until the day of or the day before it happened. And
Mhm.
when it the day before you okay, he's acting out or she's acting out.
Right.
Normal teenage there is no actual and what I have learned in my research is there's really no actual way to be able to tell if somebody is going to do it unless they do it.
Right. The only thing that I was able to find, which I think is really interesting, and I'm almost hesitant to discuss it because it leads to the possibility of some discrimination. So I want to say this with a caveat. First of all, we do know that like 96% of shooters are male. Like that, just go back and look at, all of the school shootings. They've all been male. But
Yeah, that's undisputable.
right. So, but one study did find that there was a high percentage of autism spectrum disorder in shooters. 8% of shooters had autism spectrum disorder versus 0.8% in the general population. Now, I want to really, really explain what that means because it doesn't mean that being autistic or being on the spectrum causes you to be a school shooter. What we're looking at are the factors that are the ones that influence the diagnosis. So, people who have autism or who are on the spectrum, we also know tend to be bullied. They tend to be unseen by their classmates. They tend to experience a lot of isolation and rejection. They also may have a lack of empathy because they can't read social cues very well, which then increases isolation, increases rejection. So what we did find in some of these school shootings is that there was often in these individuals a desire to be seen or to get retribution for being bullied. Now,
Right.
parents may say, I didn't know my kid was being bullied, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And here's where the most difficult part is if there is no record of a kid ever being in treatment and the kid was never really a problem at school. The only documentation we have, because a lot of school shooters kill themselves or get killed during the shooting, the only information we get is the information that we collect after the fact, that we're trying to piece together a story using maybe journals, using social media posts, using maybe friends' reports of their behavior, which may or may not be accurate.
Because ultimately the only person who knows what's going on in that person's mind is the person doing it.
Right. So the only commonalities that they've been able to really find is social isolation due to a dysfunctional family, failed relationships, lack of face-to-face connection due to sort of a desire to just stay on social media all the time. And there was some sort of school suspension, some sort of failure, and some sort of social rejection. So that can happen to a lot of people, but I think that's what makes people with autism spectrum disorder more of a target, is because they tend to have more of these failed social relationships, difficulties with dating, that kind of thing.
Right. Right. And I understand that firsthand because my little sister is autistic and I love her to death. But I know because of her, she did get bullied a lot.
Hmm.
So, in many cases, people later report, and whether they're being honest or not, they report having seen warning signs in the shooter's behavior. But what should parents, teachers, and or students look out for if they feel like somebody might commit this heinous act?
Well, I think one of the things that's also difficult is we're looking at this, obviously, 96% of shooters are male. Your sister came to you to talk about something distressing going on. There is a possibility also that, because of a male stereotype that guys don't talk, that they're not going to come out and tell anyone that they're struggling either. So I think that could be an issue too. And it's really, look, monitor your kids' moods. Teenagers are moody by definition. We know that. But there's a difference between a moody teenager and someone who is all of a sudden behaving strangely. Right?
Yeah.
They're not themselves. They may be listening to dark music, sitting in a dark room a lot, on social media, wearing clothes that don't seem to be like them, hanging out with kids that are different from the kids that they would normally hang out with. There are signs that parents can look for to really try to identify things early on.
Right. And I would add to that, with the advancement of social media, it seems like school shooters are literally posting everything that they're going to do on social media. And to that, I say that the kids, the people that have them on social media, Snapchat, whatever, if you see it, you need to say something.
Absolutely.
It's not just a joke anymore, because if you fail to say something and then the next day you get to school and you get shot, you could have been the savior for yourself and so many others. And
Mhm.
there's so many kids that just look at Snapchat and they're like, oh, well, he's just being dumb, or oh, that's
Mhm.
funny. And what they think is funny or somebody being dumb is something that they really need to report.
Yeah.
The I think it was the Parkland shooter who literally posted his whole manifest on Snapchat. And students said that they saw the stuff on Snapchat and then they just didn't say anything.
Yeah, see something, say something. But people are also afraid of getting in trouble. But you really could be preventing something really bad from happening.
Exactly. So there's a lot of debate over how to prevent school shootings, whether it's mental health resources, security measures, or policy changes. But from your perspective as a psychologist, what is missing in this conversation?
I think we as a society have become way more disconnected. And I think that is a real problem. And here's what happens is, in a long, long time ago, before we started moving so far away from our family and our friends, we had a community. We had sort of a clan. So it wasn't just one set of eyes on you. It was multiple set of eyes on you, so that if something was going on with you, someone would pick it up pretty quickly. So now we're looking at families that may be smaller, where parents may be divorced or both parents are working long hours, so they may not be seeing their kid as much as they normally would if there was a stay-at-home parent, or if there was a community with grandma and auntie and godparents all around looking. So I think people tend to fall through the cracks that way. And even with social media, you know, going on social media instead of pursuing live interactions with people, that's a problem.
I agree. I absolutely agree. So you've worked with trauma survivors.
Yes.
What advice could you give to somebody who has been through a trauma such as a school shooting, mass shooting, or just really any type of traumatic event that would affect them?
I think there are three top things. One, validate it. Yes, it did happen. Yes, it was a horrific experience. Two, it's not your fault. Because there's always, no matter what the situation is, there's some sort of guilt, could have, would have, should have. And three, you will get better. So keep those three things in mind. The first thing when you're working with a trauma victim, and the fourth thing, which is really, you're safe now. whatever happened to you, you're safe now. And really helping the person discriminate between this was a bad event that happened, but not everyone is bad.
Right.
Because it really shapes our sense of safety in the world.
Well, yeah, you're essentially attacked in somewhere that's supposed to be a safe space.
Right. Right. And it could be any kind of trauma, right? Like whether it's a sexual assault, whether it's a school shooting, whether it's, someone driving through Times Square in a car and trying to run over people.
Right. Yeah, it's that's why I broadened it because yeah, the episode is about school shootings, but when it comes to this type of trauma, it's more than just school shootings.
Right.
And I mean, your example of the New Year's Eve, we're going to call it a massacre because that's what it was in New Orleans. Nobody down on Bourbon Street thought that that was going to happen that night. But because of the law enforcement situational awareness in that situation, they were able to get it contained rather quickly. But the fact that it still happened and nobody expected it to happen, that's the whole being attacked in your safe space. Whether, when I'm out in public, if I'm with my friends, I consider that a safe space. I don't expect to get attacked while I am with my friends. But if it happens, the first thing I'm going to think, I'm not going to blame my friends. I'm going to question, how the hell did this happen?
Right.
Why didn't I see it coming? I will blame myself before I blame anybody else. Why
Mhm.
didn't I see it coming? I should have seen it coming.
Right.
And I feel like that's probably how survivors of tragedies often feel is, why didn't I see it coming? Why couldn't I have prevented it? And the truth is, you couldn't have.
Right. That's
But
exactly it. You couldn't have. We're looking to try to get some control over a situation that is not controllable.
exactly. And I mean, you're the professional, but I feel like that is our mind trying to reconcile
Yeah.
everything, so to speak.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Putting it back in our control. So you have to help the individual find other ways to convince themselves and to recognize where they are in control.
Yeah,
And that comes from resilience. You might not be able to control the things that happen to you in this world, but you can control the aftermath of it.
absolutely. And I speak a lot about resilience, especially in with this show, the Survivor series, because if you survive something like a school shooting, or I mean, I covered the Fukushima earthquake, the DC 10 that FedEx flight that got hijacked and that
Mhm.
the crew like contained him. None of that would have been achieved. Those people wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for resilience.
Mhm.
And the guy who was literally on his last breath as the plane was coming down from the DC-10 episode or incident, it took resilience for him to stay alive to get
Yes.
better. And like you said, that's something that people need to understand. For one, it's not your fault. For two, you are safe. For three, as long as you're resilient, you will make it through.
And find your community, right? This
That
is the worst time to isolate.
right. Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to tragedy, the worst thing that you can do is isolate.
Right.
When it comes to any type of loss, any type of grief, I know from personal experience, the worst thing you can do is
Yep. And you
so
definitely want to rebuild those relationships, and sit with the people who help you, who make you feel good.
yeah, and honestly, in my personal opinion, because I am not a licensed psychologist, Laughter is the best medicine.
I agree.
Absolutely, hands down. If you can find something, anything that can make you laugh in that moment, whether it is you remembering something that one of your friends that, you know, tragically got killed, remember something stupid that they were doing. It's okay to laugh during the pain. It is okay to laugh. Nobody is going to judge you. And if they do, they don't mean anything.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know what? Limit the social media, especially after the event. People go looking for more data, more information. They watch it on repeat. That's not helpful.
Yeah. Well, and they also end up running into the people who are there just for trolling measure. The ones who don't care about your feelings and they're going to make it so much worse.
Right.
And the last thing that you're going to be able to do while you're grieving is to turn away from what they're saying because somewhere in the back of your mind, your brain is telling you they're right. They're
Right.
right when they're not right at all. So I absolutely agree. Limit social media after a tragic event. So, how can we as a society, and this will be my last question, we can wrap it up. How can we as a society foster resilience and healing for those who are impacted?
Think we have to be role models for resilience and healing ourselves. And that goes way before any incident actually happens. Our children watch us very carefully. They hear the things that we say, but they also watch how we behave. And so they're watching how you respond to any kind of challenge in your life. And if they see you fall apart, they're much more likely to fall apart themselves. So be mindful of your own capacity for resilience and what you want to be teaching your children. Speak about these incidents with your kids in a developmental way that's appropriate. Right. So if a kid comes to you and says, "Hey, I just saw this on the news," that's a great time to have a conversation with your kid about, well, what did you think about that? Or, how would you be if that happened here? And really kind of, you're almost going through it before you go through it. And you're sort of priming the nervous system, not to make it happen, but to kind of think about, gee, what are my coping skills like? What would I do?
Right. And I mean, I love that you gave that example because I can remember the first time I asked my mom about something that happened on the TV, and it's a day that everyone remembers, which is 9/11. My school, I was raised in Southern Indiana, and for some reason, which I wasn't mad at it, I had no idea why it was happening, but for some reason, our elementary school in the middle of a cornfield was like, "Hey, we need to shut down and evacuate
Mhm.
because whatever, cool." I was happy. It all changed, and I remember I get through the door of my house, and my mom's got the TV on. She
Mhm.
didn't know that I had walked through the door, and I had walked through the door at the same time the first tower started to free
Mm.
fall. And I said, "What's going on?" And my mom turned around and she had this ghostly look on her face. And somehow this woman went from the edge of a complete meltdown to the calmest woman I have ever met. And she explained it to me. And she said, "I don't expect you to understand this because there's a lot of bad in the world, but this is what happened." And I think that me interrupting her, it helped her to try and process it a little better because as parents, the last thing we're going to do if we can help it to break down in front of our kids. So, I mean, I have always looked at my mom as a hero for that moment alone because she could have just turned back around and started bawling. but she didn't. She was freaking Wonder Woman. I mean, still tragic, and I will always remember that day and how it went down. And I was only 11 years old. I had literally just turned 11 years old the month before.
Right. Right.
But that's trauma.
It's absolutely trauma. So I grew up on Long Island, and I was actually driving towards the city that day when I saw the smoke in the air. And because of where I live, I had classmates who passed away in the towers. I had a relative who escaped from the towers. So where I lived, it was all over us.
Right, I
You
can
you
imagine.
you couldn't escape it. And so, we know also that some people just have more of an inborn capacity for resilience than other people based on, just based on their own personality style. But being able to reassure your children that they're safe while describing to them in an age appropriate way what's going on can be helpful. And what would we do in another situation like this? Well, mommy and daddy would take care of you, or whatever it happens to be.
Right. And like I said, getting on the bus and coming home, I just thought, hell yeah, it's a day off of school, like a whole day
Right.
off of school for
Mhm.
no reason. As a part of that trauma, while I was not there in New York, I wasn't a part of that whole, just watching that tower fall and literally seeing people jump as it
Yes.
falls. That was enough for me to
Mhm.
remember for the rest of my life.
Yep. Right.
And that's trauma, folks.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. And even, even hearing it, people were attached to the TV forever and forever and forever, right? And so you are seeing all of that over and over and over. Yep.
But as much as 9/11 has affected us and, the trauma that we will live with for the rest of our lives, what people who are what people who survive tragic situations need to understand is, just like you and we were to be resilient, and we worked through our trauma, and while it's still there, we can manage it, and
Right.
we can use our experience from our trauma to help others.
That's right.
And if there's one thing that I could tell anybody that has been through trauma and you've survived it, it is your responsibility to help the next person, because you have the answers. You know how to get through it. So it's on you to help the next person. That is all that I have for you, Dr. Ellick. Thank you so much for coming back. I had such an amazing time and such an amazing conversation with you today, and I appreciate you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we do have some great conversations. I love it.
We really do.
That's how it works.
That's right. All right. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
That was an incredibly powerful conversation with Dr. Ellick, and I think it sheds light on just how complex this issue really is. There's so much to unpack. The impact on survivors, the role of mental health, and the way these events ripple through the entire communities. Now, let's take what we've just learned and dive even deeper. In this next segment, we're going to break down some of the biggest misconceptions surrounding school shootings, the real challenges survivors face, and the long-term effects that don't always make the headlines. Let's get into it. Columbine High School, the attack that changed America. The date was April 20th, 1999. The location, Littleton, Colorado. Before Columbine, school shootings weren't a common part of American consciousness. They happened, but not on this scale. Not like this. 2 students, armed with a terrifying level of firepower, entered their high school and executed a premeditated attack that left 13 people dead and 24 more injured. At 11:19 a.m., the assailants opened fire outside the school, shooting students near the west entrance. 11:22 a.m., they entered the school, moving through the halls and the library, targeting students at random. 11:35 a.m., the attack reaches its deadliest point in the library, where 10 students are killed in under 7 minutes. 12:08 p.m. After 45 minutes of terror, the assailants take their own lives. The police response? Delayed and outdated. Law enforcement arrived quickly, but did not enter immediately. SWAT teams were not trained for active shooters at the time, so they followed a contain and wait strategy. The delay allowed the attackers to continue their rampage without immediate intervention. The impact. Columbine was supposed to be a wake-up call. It exposed flaws in police response, school security, and our understanding of mass shooters. It should have led to real change. But as we now know, it didn't. Fast forward to December 14th, 2012. Sandy Hook, the day innocence was stolen. The location, Newtown, Connecticut. Columbine was supposed to be a wake-up call. 13 years later, we were still asleep. And then, Sandy Hook. A 20-year-old assailant, armed with a semi-automatic rifle, entered Sandy Hook Elementary and turned a place of learning into a war zone. 20 children and 6 adults were murdered. Some were shot at close range. Some were hiding, hoping the monster wouldn't find them, but he did. "9:30 a.m. The assailant arrives at Sandy Hook, shooting his way through a locked glass door. 9:35 a.m. He moves through the school, targeting classrooms of first graders. 9:40 a.m. Teachers and students are barricading doors, hiding in closets, trying to shield children with their own bodies. 9:46 a.m. The shooting ends. The assailant taking his own life as police finally enter the school. Parents waited in a nearby firehouse, praying their child's name would be called. For 20 families, that call never came. The images from that day, tiny backpacks left behind, Christmas decorations still hanging in classrooms, shattered the nation. The response from politicians? Thoughts and prayers. If the brutal murder of first graders wasn't enough to force legislative change, then what would be? Assault rifles remained legal. Background checks weren't strengthened. The conversation moved on as it always does. Families of the victims have spent over a decade fighting for change, but the cycle of inaction continued. Never again. That's what we said after Columbine. Then Sandy Hook happened, and then Parkland, and then Uvalde. The list goes on. How many more times do we have to say never again before it actually means something? Parkland, the massacre that fueled a movement. February 14th, 2018, Parkland, Florida. Parkland wasn't just another mass shooting. It was a tipping point. The day 17 people were killed, but something else was born. The March for Our Lives movement. A 19-year-old gunman walked into Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School armed with an AR-15, unleashing terror on students and teachers. But what made Parkland different wasn't just the sheer violence. It was the survivors. They weren't going to sit back and just let their peers become another statistic. They weren't going to just let this tragedy slip into the forgotten pile. They stood up. They shouted. They demanded change. And for once, the nation listened. At 2:19 p.m., the assailant opens fire in the school, killing 17 and injuring 17 more in the span of just 6 minutes. 2:25 p.m., police arrive, but the assailant has already fled the scene and the lockdown begins. At 2:30 p.m., the assailant is arrested and charged with 17 counts of murder and 17 counts of attempted murder. Following the attack, Parkland survivors immediately began organizing. They held rallies, participated in marches, and used their voices to push for stronger gun laws. Politicians? Well, they repeated the same rhetoric. Thoughts and prayers. But this time, something different happened. See, in Florida, when a tragedy happens, we don't just sit around and wait for the next one. We have a majority of people that care about this state who run this state. So what happened in Florida was our lawmakers passed legislation raising the minimum age to purchase a rifle. It wasn't enough, but it was progress. Parkland led to a massive youth-led movement. The #NeverAgain campaign was born, and thousands of young people across the nation rallied for gun reform, making it clear that this generation wouldn't stand for inaction anymore. Well, while there's been some movement, nothing close to what's needed has been achieved. Parkland survivors have faced pushbacks, threats, and attempts to discredit their calls for change. Still, they stand strong and they keep fighting, and yet the cycle continues. Each tragedy following Parkland feels just like the last one. Politicians say thoughts and prayers and then do nothing. Uvalde, a tragedy marked by inaction. Date, May 24th, 2022. Location, Uvalde, Texas. Robb Elementary, a place where children should have felt safe, became the site of one of the most devastating school shootings in U.S. history. On that day, an 18-year-old former student entered the school and killed 19 children and 2 teachers, injuring at least 17 others. 11:28 a.m. After a violent altercation at home, the assailant drove to Robb Elementary, crashing his truck near the school and proceeding on foot. 11:32 a.m. He enters the school through an unlocked door, initiating the attack in classrooms 111 and 112. 11:40 a.m. A teacher in room 102 managed to call 911, whispering about the gunshots heard in the nearby classroom. 12:50 p.m. Over an hour later, a Border Patrol tactical unit breached the classroom, fatally shooting the assailant. Nearly 400 officers from different agencies were present during the incident. However, they waited over 70 minutes before confronting the shooter. This delay has been widely criticized as a monumental failure, leading to questions about priority and training. The aftermath saw efforts to hold those responsible accountable. Former Uvalde Schools Police Chief Pete Arredondo faced criminal charges due to the delayed response. A judge recently ruled against dismissing these charges, and his trial is scheduled for October 2025. Among the victims was Jose Flores Jr., a 10-year-old aspiring police officer. Posthumously, he was made an honorary NYPD officer, highlighting his dreams and the profound loss felt by his family and community. Why did trained officers hesitate in the face of imminent danger? How can we prevent such tragedies in the future? And are you as angry as I am right now? Because these questions demand answers, and these victims deserve justice. Misconceptions about school shootings. Number 1. School shootings only happen in certain places. This is a dangerous and false narrative that many people believe. School shootings can happen anywhere, urban, suburban, or rural areas. The truth is, school shootings are not confined to a particular region, demographic, or type of school. As seen in tragedies like Sandy Hook, Parkland, Uvalde, and other places, no place of learning is safe from the possibility of violence. Number 2. Only mentally ill individuals commit school shootings. While mental illness may play a role in some cases, it is not a sole factor. Many shooters exhibit signs of social isolation, anger, and ideological beliefs before carrying out such horrific acts. The assumption that mental illness is the sole factor can lead to oversimplifying the issue and ignoring the complex nature of the problem. We must look at underlying causes, including societal factors like bullying, lack of support systems, and access to firearms. Number 3, stricter gun laws won't prevent school shootings. Some people argue that gun control doesn't stop shootings. But the truth is that stronger gun laws can help prevent the wrong people from gaining access to firearms. Countries with stringent gun laws, such as Australia, have seen a significant decline in mass shootings. The US needs to reassess how easy it is for individuals, especially those with violent intentions, to obtain firearms. Background checks, waiting periods, and limits on assault weapons could help reduce gun violence. Number 4, all school shootings are the same. Each school shooting is unique in its own right. The motives, circumstances, and outcomes can vary greatly. It's important not to lump all incidents together as one. For example, the tragic shooting at Sandy Hook was driven by a young man's personal issues, while the Parkland shooting involved a troubled student with a history of behavioral issues. Understanding the nuances in each situation can better inform how we approach prevention and response. Number 5, the shooter always has a history of violence or threats. While some shooters do display what are called red flags before the attack, many do not have a history of criminal or violent behavior or make direct threats beforehand. This unpredictability makes prevention efforts more complicated. The rise in school security and active shooter drills in the recent years reflects the widespread uncertainty about when and where a shooting could occur. Scrutiny of law enforcement and officer response. The good, the bad, and the ugly. First, let's start with good. In many instances, law enforcement officers respond quickly and decisively in the face of danger. When tragedy strikes, some officers risk their own lives to protect the lives of others, exhibiting extraordinary bravery. Take, for example, the officers who responded to Sandy Hook. Despite the chaos, they were able to neutralize the threat and save lives. These instances are a reminder that law enforcement can be a force for good, often showing up in situations where others would flee in fear. The courage and dedication of these officers should not be overlooked. The bad. Unfortunately, not all responses are as quick or effective. The Uvalde shooting, for example, is a glaring example of law enforcement's hesitation in the face of overwhelming danger. Nearly 400 officers were on the scene, but it took more than 70 minutes for them to breach the classroom where the assailant was holed up. This delay in response led to harsh criticism of the officers involved, many of whom faced accusations of failing to act decisively to save lives. A lack of coordination, failure to follow established protocols, and inaction left many people asking why more wasn't done sooner. And then we get to the ugly. The Parkland shooting also highlighted major flaws in law enforcement's response. In this case, a school resource officer was present but failed to confront the shooter. Furthermore, there were numerous missed opportunities to intervene before the tragedy occurred. A long history of warning signs, including violent threats, behavior issues, and reports to law enforcement, were ignored and mishandled. The lack of communication between agencies and a failure to act on warnings contributed to the devastating consequences. It is clear that there are serious issues with how school shootings are handled on the ground. While we must acknowledge the bravery and the dedication of many officers, these tragic events also expose a major gap in law enforcement training, preparedness, and the ability to respond to active shooter situations. We can no longer afford to ignore the lessons learned from these failures. The psychological toll on survivors of school shootings is immense and can last a lifetime. For many, PTSD, depression, anxiety, and survivor's guilt become a permanent part of their lives. The trauma of witnessing horrific violence, losing friends or teachers, and fearing for their own lives doesn't simply vanish after the incident is over. Survivors often struggle to reintegrate into daily life, facing challenges in relationships, school, work, and emotional stability. Many have reported flashbacks, nightmares, and constant feeling of vulnerability. The healing process can take years and requires ongoing support from mental health professionals, family, and the community. For example, survivors of the Parkland shooting have been outspoken about their ongoing struggles, with many still grappling with the psychological scars left behind that day. Some survivors have become activists, channeling their pain into the fight for gun violence and school safety, while others continue to battle their own mental health issues. But the journey toward healing is not linear. Some experience periods of relative peace, followed by intense relapses into grief, anger, and fear. Law enforcement, paramedics, firefighters, and other first responders who deal with the aftermath of school shootings often face profound psychological challenges. The trauma of witnessing unspeakable violence and having to deal with the bodies of children and teachers can haunt these individuals for the rest of their careers and lives. Many first responders are at risk of burnout, PTSD, and substance abuse as they struggle to cope with the emotional weight of these traumatic events. While some agencies provide counseling and support programs, the mental health needs of first responders are often overlooked or underfunded. The stigma surrounding seeking help can prevent many from getting the support they need. The constant exposure to tragedy, especially in active shooter situations, takes an immense toll on their mental health and well-being. The impact on the broader community, families, friends, neighbors, and fellow students can be just as devastating. When a school shooting occurs, it shakes the entire foundation of that community. Parents live in fear of sending their children to school. Teachers are left traumatized and afraid of returning to the classroom. The ripple effect of such violence spreads far beyond the immediate victims and alters the course of a community's life for many years to come. Many communities experience increased anxiety, decreased community trust, and a loss of the sense of safety and normalcy that once existed. Communities are left to rebuild, not just physically, but emotionally. Schools often need to offer counseling service. Memorials are set up, and families must navigate a never-ending cycle of grief and loss. Collective trauma is real, and scars left by school shootings don't fade with time. They just deepen. The pain of losing a loved one is unbearable, but losing someone in a school shooting is an anguish that feels unnatural, unfathomable. It is a wound that never truly heals, and no amount of time can make it easier to bear. The families left behind face a lifetime of grief, often amplified by the public nature of their loss, the media circus, the constant reminders, the unanswered questions, and the overwhelming public scrutiny can compound their suffering in ways no one should endure. In the aftermath of a school shooting, family members find themselves forced into the spotlight, whether they like it or not. They become symbols of the tragedy, their loved ones' names forever tied to the senseless violence that took their lives. But behind every headline, behind every news report, there's a family member trying to comprehend a world without their child, their sibling, their parent. The pain is not just emotional, it's psychological, physical, and spiritual. In the case of the Sandy Hook tragedy, the families of the 26 victims continue to struggle with the emotional scars left by the event. Many of them have become outspoken advocates for gun reform, channeling their grief into the fight to prevent future tragedies. But the reality is that no law, no reform can bring back their loved ones. Their battle for justice is not just against those responsible for the tragedy. It's a battle against a system that failed to protect their children and failed to hold the powerful accountable. Families of victims are often left in the wake of a system that prioritizes profit and politics over people. They fight for their loved ones' memories to be honored, for their voices to be heard in the fight for change. The grief of losing a child in a senseless act of violence cannot be quantified, nor can the lifelong impact it has on the families who must continue without them. The road to healing is a long and difficult one that truly never ends. As we reflect on these families, we must ask ourselves, how many more? How many more families must endure this pain before we demand change? The statistics on school shootings are stark and sobering. Since 2001, more than 200,000 students have experienced a shooting on their school campus. However, it's the number of lives lost that should really shake us to our core. As of 2023, over 400 victims, students, teachers, staff, and bystanders have been killed in school shootings. But the number doesn't tell the full story. It doesn't reflect the countless lives impacted by the injury, trauma, or fear of what could happen next. It doesn't account for the families who have lost loved ones, the communities that have been irreparably shaken, or the ongoing mental health battles that survivors face. The numbers are only rising. In 2022 alone, there were more than 300 school shootings, the highest number recorded in a single year. The numbers keep climbing as this tragic epidemic grows more pervasive. Every life lost is a reminder of the critical need for action. These numbers are not just statistics. They are real people with real families whose lives were cut short by the deadly consequences of inaction and complacency. What is truly staggering is that many of these deaths could have been prevented if common sense measures had been put in place. If we had acted when we knew that the number of shootings was rising, if we had listened to the voices of survivors and families who have been forever changed by these senseless tragedies. When we think about these numbers, we need to remember that each one represents a life, a story cut short, a potential never realized. Let me make this crystal clear. If you choose to ignore this issue, to stand by and do nothing, then you are a part of the problem. You can no longer hide behind the excuse of, I don't want to get involved. You have to be a part of the solution, or else you are just as responsible as those who actively fight against change. This isn't a time for indifference, for silence, or for politics. This is a time for action, for demanding better, for standing up for what's right, for demanding a future where our children, teachers, and loved ones don't have to live in fear of a school shooting. Let's talk about politicians. The ones who stand up in front of the cameras, offer empty promises, and then walk away without doing a damn thing to make a real change. They say thoughts and prayers, but their actions say we don't care. These are the same people who take campaign donations from gun manufacturers, who pocket kickbacks from the very companies that profit off the bloodshed of innocent lives. They praise the Second Amendment at every turn, but fail to acknowledge how our laws have been twisted to let gun manufacturers flourish while families mourn. These politicians who repeatedly claim they'll fix this, yet refuse to pass any meaningful reform, are complicit. They're selling our safety for profit, and that has to stop. And let's not forget the media, the way they sensationalize school shootings, turning tragedies into entertainment, into ratings. Welcome to the 5 o'clock news. You have your spot. They exploit the pain of the survivors and the families, turning them into freak shows for public consumption. We saw it in Sandy Hook, with Stoneman Douglas, with every other horrific shooting. The media focuses and glorifies the shooter as if their name is worth remembering, as if their actions are somehow news story. Have you noticed how I have not mentioned the shooters' names at any point during this episode because I refuse to give them that type of attention? Meanwhile, they completely ignore the victims, the families, the community that has to carry the weight of this loss. This sensationalism only feeds the cycle, making the next shooter feel like they can get some twisted fame. It's sickening. And then we have the audacity of people like Alex Jones, who called the Sandy Hook survivors crisis actors. These are the same individuals who mock, dismiss, and belittle those who have lived through these tragedies. They don't just disrespect the victims. They undermine the reality of this epidemic. They profit off of the tragedy, selling lies and spreading hatred. And what do lawmakers offer as solutions? Gun-wielding teachers? Bulletproof backpacks for kids? Is this where we have sunk into? This isn't safety. This isn't a solution. It's a Band-Aid on a literal bullet wound. Instead of implementing common sense reforms like background checks and stricter gun laws, they propose more violence, more fear, more insecurity. Teachers are not soldiers. Our children should not have to go to school feeling like they're preparing for battle. This is not about gun control. This is about human decency. This is about protecting our kids, our community, our future. If we don't take action now, this will continue. And every day we fail to act, we are complicit in the next tragedy. So get involved. Demand that your voice be heard. Hold those in power accountable for their inaction. Push for real change. This is about lives. Real lives. The more we raise our voices, the more pressure we put on these politicians, the more likely we are to see meaningful change. But it starts with you, right now. We've covered a lot today. Some harsh truths, some gut-wrenching realities, and some things that should never be ignored again. But now, it's time to take everything we've learned and turn it into action. The anger, the sadness, the frustration you feel, don't let that fade. Let it fuel you. Let it fuel you to demand change, to speak out, to stand up. Because we cannot afford to let this continue. The victims deserve justice, and the survivors deserve peace. As we close out today's episode, I want you to remember that your voice matters. You matter. And every action you take, no matter how small, is a step closer to a safer future for all of us. We can't wait for someone else to fix this. We are the ones who need to do it. And together, we can. We'll be back next week with another episode. But until then, stay strong, stay focused, and let's never stop fighting for what's right. Good night, and take care of each other.
This episode of the Survivors series was hosted by Kyle Fields, written and researched by Mary Rodriguez, and produced by One Love Media. All rights reserved. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow us on social media and subscribe for future episodes. Until next time, stay safe and stay strong.